Welcome to Mr. Bogema's TNReady U.S. History Must-Knows. This is Standard 2, Federal Policies Towards Native Americans. So we're looking at how did the federal government respond to Native Americans, and this is connected with Westward Expansion, Standard 1, which we had a video on previously. So if you remember, the Homestead Act encouraged Americans to settle the West, but the West was not empty. It had been, Native Americans had been living out West for thousands of years. So there was going to be a big conflict between American settlers and Native Americans. And we have several big conflicts. If you remember the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer versus the Lakota Sioux and the Black Hills of the Dakotas, as settlers pushed in for looking for resources, mostly gold, farmland. So we have battles, and ultimately Native Americans are forced onto reservations. So reservations, government land that these Native American tribes were forced to live on. And as they're forced onto these reservations, many tribes get desperate, like the Lakota Sioux. They start performing a ghost dance, hoping that their ancestors would come back to help them remove the American settlers from their land. And the federal government doesn't really particularly care for that. And Sitting Bull, a famous leader of the Sioux, is killed by reservation police in a conflict. And upon his death, a lot of the Sioux leave their reservation and they are massacred at Wounded Knee by the federal army. The other topic here is something called the Dawes Act. And the purpose of the Dawes Act was to assimilate Native Americans into the American way of life. And remember, assimilation is the process of becoming more like your environment. So this was done through boarding schools, and the key term you need to know is the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act turned reservation lands into farmland, and it was sold, and the purpose was to turn Native Americans into farmers, and that way they'd be assimilated into an American occupation, and they'd lose their tribal identity. And sadly, a lot of the reservation lands were sold, and it had a very tragic effect on Native American culture in the West. Let's look at our EOC questions associated with this standard. So the first question we have here is, the primary objective of the Dawes Act was to do what? Now, a lot of students usually tend to choose B, turn American Indian reservations into farmland, but that is partially correct, but the word here, corporate farmland, is incorrect. So individuals were buying this land, and that makes it an incorrect answer. And we talked a lot about assimilation on the previous slide. The purpose of the Dawes Act was to promote assimilation of Native Americans into American culture. So we're going to go with A. In our second EOC question, we have boarding schools. Remember, the federal government wanted to remove tribal identity of these Western Native American tribes, and so school was the primary way of assimilating Native Americans. So how to dress, how to speak, teaching them English, English literature, the English language. So you can see the transformation here in the picture. And so we're talking about assimilating into your new environment. So their old environment was destroyed by Western migration, and then they have a new environment where they have to be Americanized. So we're going to go with assimilation. And that's it for Standard 2.